Our speaker is Richard P. Howard. He was born on March 17th, which is St. Patrick's Day, because I have the same birthday. And 1930 is mine. His is 34, which makes him about 33 years old, in Toledo, Ohio, and he was reared in Toledo. He studied engineering at John Carroll University in Cleveland, graduated in architecture from the University of Detroit in 1958, and while he was a student, worked for James Kahn AIA in Southfield, Michigan, and Giffords and Rossetti, which is a very fine firm in Detroit, Michigan. Upon graduation, he joined the firm of Richards, Bauer, and Moorhead, Toledo, Ohio. And it was Richards, the head of this firm, John Noble Richards, who was a past president of the AIA and a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, who encouraged Howard to open his own business specializing in architectural renderings and models. That was in March of 1959. So his firm, which is known as Howard Associates, consists of 12 employees with offices in Sylvania, Ohio, which is a suburb of Toledo. Howard Associates serves architects in the northwestern and eastern states and has sales representatives in Detroit, Cleveland, and New York City. The firm has a particular interest in architects in Indiana, and the firm is currently doing work for many Indiana architects, at least 3 of whom are here tonight. Richard Howard.
Thank you, Dean Satterfield. We have kind of a private joke in my studio where we say if we are unsure of an architect's details on his building, we cover it up with a tree. And architects these days are generally pressured by everybody from politicians to fundraisers, and sometimes even they are amazed that we can return to them a drawing that is anything but a pure forest. I can tell by the introduction and the lovely dinner I had tonight that I am welcome here, and I feel very much at home being back on a campus in the School of Architecture, and I'll try to remember and make a promise here tonight that if I ever do renderings for any of you, I will not bury you behind trees. So. When I talk tonight, I'll refer to you all as architects, since you all aspire to be architects. And I see from the crowd there are probably some girl students of architecture here, and probably more likely some girlfriends of the male students. And if any of these women have aspirations of marrying an architect, I think we might as well call them architects tonight too, because if they think they're not going to be involved in this profession, I think they ought to have their head examined. That was an architect's wife. I think I understand that last week or the last month you've had a display of furniture, and Mr. Lackney was saying how they had some very fine pieces in here, and it reminds me of when I was first married and I brought my wife back to the University of Detroit to finish the last semester, and I went on a long program of indoctrinating her into appreciating designer furniture. And I showed her all the architectural magazines and all the California printed matter on Van Keppel Green, and I took her to Yamasaki's education center at Wayne State University, the McGregor Memorial, and to Reynolds Aluminum Building, which has a very fine interior, and I showed her all of this fine furniture, including the showrooms in Birmingham, Michigan, of Nelson, and also the Knoll Associates showroom in Detroit. And finally, as if she had returned from a evangelistic meeting, she one day decided she really loved this furniture, that it was great, and that It just simply to express modern materials, and she understood what we had been talking about and what I had been trying to teach her, and she said, and I want 4 Barcelona chairs and a Mies cocktail table and a deep pile orange rug. And I said, you're supposed to like it, you can't have it. So much for the financial rewards of a budding young architect. I think Barbara Lackney could probably be witness to young architects, and that when I met the Lackneys, they had an apartment in Toledo and were quite often entertained all the young architects in Toledo and several artists and people in the theater, and we used to gather over there, and everyone remarked at how lovely the interior was handled and its simplicity and its architectural design, and they had nothing but empty rooms. There was only one criteria, and everything had to be painted white. It was kind of embarrassing when he used to invite his mother over for dinner. He'd say, Ma, here, have a seat on the floor. The talk tonight will be primarily on my business, which is rendering, which I think is pretty much a unique business in that of all the services that an architect buys outside of his office, which are many, a lot of architects buy some or all of their engineering services, structural, mechanical, electrical, and so forth. And I think they do this with great relief. Most of the architects know something about each one of these businesses and could possibly carry out the scheme to its fullest, but they obtain the service of an engineer in order to get the best professional guidance on it so that they can devote as much time as possible to the design aspect. And it seems to me, with a little bit of reluctance, that they turn to the illustrator then and have him do the one thing that they would like to do themselves, and that is an architectural rendering. And usually this is because of the time factor. I think any architect that I've met in this state or any other, and I've been in probably more architectural design offices and in to see the designers of more firms than most people in the allied architectural fields have. I think just about every architect who was worth his salt and just about every architect who was doing design could be a top-notch illustrator. And this brings me to one of the points that I think is most the student should give most thought to in his education, and that is the fact that architects are only expressing themselves with pictures. They can draw plans all day long, but the client doesn't appreciate them, and no one in the office really grasps the situation, even to give a critique on a design problem. Everything has to be drawn in a sketch form. There are noted architects like Eero Saarinen, who, upon interviewing the best architectural design students that he could find, would always demand, as one of the first things after looking at their work, before he really met the student and talked turkey with him as far as what he wants and what the student wants to do and his philosophy on design and so forth, the one thing he would have the student do would be to go into a room with a pencil and paper and from memory draw a picture of a horse. And at first this sounds ridiculous, and yet it emphasizes the point that if this man is a designer, he has to be able to convey not only new things, but if he can convey new ideas, he certainly should be able to convey what he sees about him every day. And it's surprising in talking to architects who knew Saarinen, of course I did not, that over and over again I hear this story related of how this man used this horse as a test. I have a good friend in Cleveland who is a partner with a Cleveland firm who came from Saarinen's office, who went through that same test, and he often relates the story of another young man who came into the office and was given this test, and the man came out and said, Mr. Saarinen, I just can't draw a horse. No, I just haven't been around horses. So Mr. Saarinen sent him back in and told him to draw the figure of an unclothed woman. And he came out a little later and he said, well, that's just one of the things I can't draw. He said, couldn't you give me something else? And he said, well, I'd have you draw a man, but I'm afraid you take your clothes off to do it, and I don't like that around here, so you just go on. In talking at dinner tonight with some of the architects, in kind of testing out my thinking, I put the question to them that if a young man was to come to them looking for a job as a designer and had the ability to draw rough sketches in perspective, would he stand a better chance of getting that job than possibly better draftsmen out of architectural schools or more intellectual types who could talk better? To balance, what would be the balance between the man who can draw and the man who cannot draw? And they seem to agree unanimously that there's no comparison, that the man who wants to get off on a good foot as a young man, as an architect, has got to be able to draw, and he's the man who will be chosen to meet with the clients, with the architect, to express the ideas within the office, and ultimately to project his own ideas into his own sketches. It's the kind of thing where when you graduate in architecture in this business, there's just no pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. They don't care what you look like to begin with, and the first thing they want to see in the interview is your sketches. You have no snow job. No architectural student gets hired just on a snow job. I put an ad in the Detroit paper looking for an architectural illustrator several months ago, and the newspaper made a mistake, and instead of signing the ad, Howard Associates, they abbreviated Associates, and instead of using ASSOC period, they used ASS period. And I got the biggest snow job letter I have ever seen from a graduating student. I stated in the ad I wanted a man with experience. He obviously had no experience from reading the letter, and yet he wouldn't come out and tell me that, so that I could possibly feel that the interest was there so that he would cultivate it. But he avoided the subject and just went on with a flowery description on his philosophy of illustrating and pictorial graphics, and it was really a beautifully written letter, but it contained almost nothing. I also had a answer which contained a 3x5 photograph of a nicely done rendering and a little note on it saying that this is a rendering I have done. I'm interested in rendering, and you can reach me at this number. Now that's the man that I called. Of course, I'll have to admit the other guy didn't have too much standing for him, because when he started out his letter, he said, "Dear Mr. Ass." So maybe I was a little prejudiced. So I guess the biggest point that I have for the students here, when they're looking at the renderings, which I'll show tonight, most of which, some of them I did, a lot of them are done by people within my organization. But the point that the student should take is that he can do these renderings. If he's going to be an architect and he put his mind to it, he could do them, and yet we don't want him to do them. These are finished renderings used for public relations and bond issues and so forth. These are the kind of renderings you as architects will go out of the office to buy. And yet it's the idea of being able to draw perspectives freehand and shades and shadows, knowing values, being able to get contrast and guts into just the simplest little line perspective is what the architects you're going to be working for are going to be looking for in you. This is what they want to see. There are a lot of great buildings designed today. A few of the jobs that I have worked on have been of interest to me from the student standpoint. One of which you'll see a photograph or a slide of tonight was a research center in Detroit, in Cleveland, by Dalton & Dalton. Their head designer is an ex-Sarnan employee, designer for Sarnan, and he used the exact same approach on that Sarnan did when they designed General Motors Technical Center, where there was another firm in that case even doing the working drawings. And on the Cleveland job by Dalton & Dalton, they had 75 sheets of design drawings, and there wasn't one line drawn on that with a T-square or a triangle. And these were the drawings which the client would see along with rough perspectives. These are the drawings that the design critics on it, the partners in charge and the designers in charge, would crit from and build small-scale models of, mock-ups to see details. But every detail on that building could be found in a little small perspective somewhere tucked away in a corner, whether it was the flashing from the roof into the brick, or whether it was a column detail or a nut and bolt holding columns together. There wasn't one thing that wasn't done in a perspective form, including reflected ceiling plans. Everything was completely thought out on this job in a set of 75 design sketch drawings, and it's only after all of this was approved that they turned to me for a professional rendering of the job. And of course, it was rather easy to construct a perspective and go right ahead and get everything correct because we had this. I would say that a good contractor could have built this multi-million-dollar project from this set of design drawings, except that in the court of law, there would not be a legal document, and therefore someone has to put this down on paper. But the architect of the future, I think, has to be more design-oriented than ever before. The draftsmen of the future are no longer coming from architectural school. They're coming from what we are now building with our tax money called technical colleges. Every state in the union now has under construction technical colleges. And all of them are teaching architectural drafting courses, and this, I think, is where the bulk of the manpower will be coming from, who will be working for you as designers, which the point I'm making is that you, as the architect, have to be increasingly aware of your ability to oversee a project, which means you have to be able to draw. Leaving the talking off here, or the lecturing, I'd like to briefly go over a few renderings here, because I'll be talking about techniques in the slide presentation. The three renderings you see here are very typical of the finished, hard-line architectural rendering. Of course, we get into shadows and so forth to soften this up. This is the type of rendering you will find with professional illustrators as architects. The same principle, however, applies with your shades and your shadows, the construction of the perspective that will apply to you when you're drawing your freehand sketch. There are other techniques over here which I'll show you slides of, which I think are more applicable to the student in trying to illustrate his project, and that here we're not worried about sky, about background trees. Here we come in and we render the building and then very lazily with pencil sketch in an entourage. This is more the type of thing that a student would be interested in presenting his own idea. In developing a rendering like the one on the top over there, there's probably, for the best professional illustrator in my office, would probably spend a whole day in just creating the sky and the background building and the background trees before he ever touched the building. Well, this is ridiculous for an architect to do. It would take him probably 3 days to do that, and he might better go out and hire somebody who does this 40 hours a week. So as we get into this, first I'll show you slides of the finished renderings we produced called full color K-scene renderings. Then I'll show you slides of several combination renderings, which would be using K-scene, color pencil. Some of them have black and white, soft line pencil. Some of them have a little bit of pen and ink in them. This is a line drawing that has had graphite smeared on the back of it. We call it pouncing. We draw the perspective from the architect's drawing, and we send them back a line drawing of the perspective as we visualize their building, and this is what they look over and approve. There's a great deal of detail left out of the sides of the building, but the illustrators doing this don't need that detail to complete the rendering. The reason this is smeared up, as I say, is because it has graphite on it, but it does show how we submit the drawing to the architect, and this is the way, the amount of line work that is put on the finished watercolor board before we start the watercolor rendering. Now the next 3 slides will show you the rendering in different stages. this progressed pretty fast. The sky here, of course, is complete. The building had been masked off with masking tape in the background and clouds put in. Then the artist proceeded to execute the glass, which is the first thing we do in a full casing rendering on the building. It's a little sloppier, moist. We use a lot of wash techniques on the glass, so we do the glass as an overall reflective pattern, and then come in using shades and shadows and build up the paint, first in sunlight, then in shade, and then in the shadow area, which is the darkest color. This is a good building to illustrate sun, shade, and shadow because it is all one material. This is all concrete of an off-white color. And an illustration, whether you bring the sun in from both sides or just one side, the basic elements that make this sparkle are the fact that there are 3 different paints used here for every material represented. The sun is the brightest and warmest. You go cooler and grayer for the shade, and very dark and cool for the shadow. This next rendering is, again, the same project. Here we have added more detail to the facade. We have added in the mullions on the first floor of the building, developing the promenade along the street. This is the completed rendering after the other buildings around it have been added. Some automobiles and people to add scale, and trees, both for scale and to soften up the building, to give it a more realistic approach here. This particular building is the new city-county building in Fort Wayne, Indiana, by A.M. Strauss & Associates. This rendering and the one that follows is a rendering of a complex of 3 buildings. We're just depicting one in this group of renderings, which is a mausoleum, some 3 stories high, each one containing, I think there's 5,000 vaults in each one of these buildings. It's quite a monumental scale, this building. Again, this is a good one to discuss from the standpoint of a person who is starting out on renderings. Here we have, again, basically one material after we finished our glass area. Again, it is a light material. In this case, I believe it was Indiana limestone. Again, we have the whites, very warm in the sun. As we turn the corner, we go cooler into the shadows and much darker. And darkest of all is cooler and darker into the shade, and the darkest of all is our shadow. The sun, shade, and shadow. This is true whether it's a pencil sketch on onion skin paper or whether it's a finished rendering like this. This is the back view of the same building. On this side, of course, the topography is much lower, the contour of the ground, so it becomes a 4-story building. You can see here the scale of this building by comparing it with the people that are walking around the outside walk. The next 3 renderings are ones we did of one project. This is the overall street or normal eye level view as you walk up to this office building, which is in downtown Cleveland. The building is located directly across, or diagonally across from the new Erie View Plaza, which is the largest or the tallest building just constructed in Cleveland. It has a very beautiful plaza, and in order to create interest in this smaller new building across the street, we used 3 renderings that the leasing agent looking for tenants for this building would use as public relations and promotion. And he would use them in this order in his presentation to him, showing him first the facade of the building. The next one is taken from the ground after you cross the street, looking back through the colonnade. In this case, there's a bank on the first floor, and you can see the large expanse and glass areas with a banking lobby on the first floor and some balconies on the second. And the dark marble masses here represent the ends of the vertical transportation, or the elevator units, which of course go all the way to the top of the building. This perspective here is the top floor, corner suite of this building, looking across the street at the new Erie View High-Rise Plaza. Here you can get a feeling of, if you were to rent this space, what the view would be as you looked out your corner window. You get the relationship of your own height to the height of the new high-rise across the street, and you also get a feeling of the buildings which are also planned in that area next to Erie View Tower, over which you can see the waterfront of Lake Erie and the city airport, downtown airport, which is located there. This building is a tobacco leaf export building in Richmond, Virginia, which is basically two materials, concrete and your brick. I was particularly interested in this rendering and this building from the standpoint of its, I think it's a very good use of brick as a material. The concrete capping the building has a coffered ceiling effect, which you immediately recognize as a structural system within the building, and the floor between the actual construction between the two floors is also a coffered ceiling pattern expressing the structure of the building. This rendering, of course, was done in full K-scene. The building was drawn, then completely masked off. The entire sky background and adjoining buildings were painted, and then the masking was removed and the artist began to work on the actual building for the architect. This is a little unusual. It's a rather ugly building. It's an old hamburger joint created into a beauty salon. But I brought it because it's a night scene, which is a little bit unusual. There are a great many architects today who are doing their own perspectives and inner office studies of buildings that make use of this technique of using the night scene to captivate the brilliancy of their building and their design. This can be done very easily by a student by taking ordinary Oslet paper that you run your prints on of your perspectives and your plans and so forth, and just running it through the machine before you have any drawing over it to give you a speckled white surface from which you can cut out the silhouette of your building, over which you work your black and white or color pencil. This is in turn mounted on a sheet of Oslet paper, which is run or put into the ammonia before it has been run through the light machine, which gives you almost an intense black background. But because of its softness and the speckled effect that you get with it, it gives you a very interesting contrast and a very realistic approach to displaying your building as it would look at night. This is a slide which is of the rendering, which is displayed over on the right-hand side. It, again, is the basics, which we have been talking about in these renderings, applies to this one. This would be a good one for students to look at, I think, and that for the full color renderings, it's probably one of the finest I have here in detail. I think you can appreciate the architect's approach to creating the concourse between the parking structure and the new hospital at the right. And although it's rendered at a very small scale, if you look closely, you can see all the different levels involved in there and people congregating on these different levels, and minute size as they are. This building here is the research center, which I was talking about before, that the architect gave us a set of design drawings of 75 sheets in which every detail on this building was done in a thumbnail perspective sketch. This is called the Great Lakes Museum, which is a museum of marine history, which is located in Vermilion, Ohio, along Lake Erie. It's a little different in that the horizon is a blending of the water and the sky. It's very appealing. It's a rendering that I show a lot of architects. There's something about a rendering when you have pretty girls and water in it, all the architects like it. This is a typical aerial view of a school, which you as architects, if you were designing a school, would purchase from a rendering firm. This is used for bond issues, for fundraising, and for publication in newspapers before elections to promote the interest in a new school for a school board. This particular job was done down in Louisiana. This project is a rendering of high-rise apartment buildings near Miami Beach, Florida. Again, this is not the kind of a rendering that the architect would do himself. The architect, in most cases, in large developments like this, are only in the position of recommending an illustrator. They have designed the buildings individually in sketch form. They have approval from their client. Generally, in these cases, the clients come directly to us, and we negotiate to create anything from one rendering to an entire brochure to help them sell investors on investing in this project. It's interesting. Occasionally, I hear how things turn out when these renderings are used to their fullest. Now, this particular rendering was done for a land development company that specializes in investing money for medical doctors. Where a group of medical doctors band together and each invest a small sum of money. Being professionals, a lot of them feel that there's a lack of knowledge of how to use their money as a good investment. But this company is in Akron, Ohio, and I know for a fact, because of talking with the owners, that within 3 weeks they had obtained, between Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, with the meetings that they had set up with the medical groups, they had obtained complete financing by using this rendering in the project. This is a hospital building for Donald Ritchie Associates in Boston, Massachusetts. It's, again, a good rendering for the student to look at from the standpoint that there are very few materials involved. It has a good structural sense to the new wing on it. They're a little apologetic on the old one, but they're stuck with it. The principles that we have been discussing here would be, again, seen very readily in this rendering. The sky is done first, the background, then the glass, then the white concrete in its 3 colors for sun, shade, and shadow, and then the brick in its 3 colors for sun, shade, and shadow. And then the foreground, grass, trees, cars, walks were put in as the last step. This is a rendering of a school done for James Associates in Indianapolis. It's a good-sized project. The interest here is in the aerial technique of rendering. There's something about aerial renderings that I think all architects object to, and I object to as an illustrator, and that no one ever sees this building the way you see it in an aerial rendering. Unfortunately, for bond issue purposes, the illustrator is many times forced to illustrate the building this way so the people can see the entire complexity. This rendering is of the new Cleveland State University in downtown Cleveland. It's very close to other projects we've worked on in Cleveland, and in size and scope, it is probably one of the most complicated renderings that we have done. This is a rendering of one of the buildings within the Cleveland State University. It's an interesting rendering from an illustrative standpoint, and the use of the concrete material in it is quite sculptural. I think it comes off very well as an architectural rendering. You may have noticed on the photographs hanging in the back on the side there, this structure, which consists of, the renderings are 3 in the set to show off this Blossom Music Center, which is a new summer home for the Cleveland Symphony. This, again, is a package of renderings that we did for fundraising purposes on the recommendation of the architect. This is the overall view showing the parking in relation to the lakes and the structure. The next rendering is a close-up view of the same structure from the other side as you would be approaching it. This is an interior view of the band shell in which you get a little better idea of the immense size of this structure. This is a university building at Bowling Green State University. It's a type of rendering we get into a lot where there's especially on campuses now, where they're no longer trying to build just one mass building to house everyone, but trying to create a cluster of buildings with an interesting court between them. This is another typical rendering, parking structure in this case. This is another typical school rendering. This particular rendering came back for some additional parking facilities that they wanted to add that we had no information on when we did the rendering, and for that reason, I brought this one along, and you can see it pinned up over here on the right. This is a small remodel job of an old building, which the architect was asked to reface the building in an interesting pattern. An eye-level view of a medical building, again used for fundraising purposes. This is a rather interesting factory building. It's a building for Avon products, who ding-dong on your door, Avon calling. This one here will be built in Georgia, and I find it rather interesting from the standpoint it's probably one of the most expensive factories ever built. It's a very rich, detailed building. You'll notice even the entrance building out the front is completely surrounded by a moat. The entire building has great thought given to it in landscaping surrounding the building to create a total architectural feeling in the building. This again is another typical type aerial. This one here is of a warehousing facility. I believe this one here is located in Pennsylvania. This is a building designed by Alden Dow Associates in Midland, Michigan, which is a civic art center for Midland. Another school rendering used for bond issue purposes. The next two renderings are a package that was created for an architect who wanted to first show the overall design in a civic center project in Flint, Michigan. This rendering gives you the relationship of the parking to the two highways which adjoin the building, and also with the entrance and the drop-off point for automotive traffic. The next rendering is a eye-level view as you would approach this from almost the same angle, only you'd be down on the ground now at 5 feet, your eye 5 foot above the ground, looking up at the structure. This is a apartment project in Indiana. This is one of the technique that I was speaking of, which I feel would be more interesting to students. In that here, the basic design of the building is expressed in a very simple pencil technique, and the only thing that's done on this board is the actual building until it is completed and until the artist is satisfied with his building. And then, very lightly and quickly, wrapped around this is a very soft pencil sketching with a little casing, trees in here to warm it up and give a little opacity to the trees. It's a very effective technique, but it's also a very quick technique. And for that reason, it's the kind of thing that, as a student, I think you would be more interested in applying to your future design projects. Yes.
I think a lot of them have seen it in color.
I didn't mean to skip over that, so. Can you go back two slides? Is this near? That's what I thought. Bob didn't recognize it, and I thought it was Ball State University. The effective thing about this rendering, this is something we try to capture, and when we're doing renderings of housing projects, is to get in between the structures on the buildings. And I think the thing that really makes this rendering come off is capturing the building on the right-hand side, the planning wall that comes out. I believe this is the administration building for the project, and was not of the most of importance to the architect in this particular rendering, and that he wanted to show the housing units. But by closing in the rendering for composition with this mass in the foreground, I think it gives a good sense of scale, and that you almost feel like you're in the garden or at the entrance to this building alongside, and you're looking over the wall at the apartment building. This is again the combination of tempera and colored pencil. Here I've used some tempera in the placement of the foliage on the trees. The grass and the parking and the background is all in the soft crayon pencil. The building is entirely in casein, but again, and I don't mean to be repetitive, but from a student standpoint, in doing this rendering, you're able to concentrate only on your building. And then after you are satisfied with it, then you go in and wrap your entourage around it. This is a public housing project in Cincinnati, which is done in the same technique. In this case, the only casein on the building is where the white concrete panels between the windows are expressed. The entire brick penthouse and all the brick in the shadow areas are done in pencil, as well as the complete foreground. This is an aerial using the same technique again. I've gone very heavy on the structure here in white casein. As far as the building is concerned, the only paint on there is white casein right out of the tube. On the entourage, I've used some green foliage, which is casein, over a tree that is done in pencil. The actual construction of the tree is done in black or brown pencil. This is a colonial building, addition to an existing colonial building, which is I believe, a children's hospital, which is done in a similar technique. Here we've added a little more color to the sky than usual, but this was done by just running soft crayon pencils over the sky in a linear fashion and blending in the blues with a little ochre color. This is a cutaway interior view of a chapel that we did for James Associates, in which it would be totally impossible to get this picture in the actual structure, and that in order to see it, the whole outer half of the building had to be removed. And yet, for the architect to put his point across on what this was going to look like as a whole, we felt it was the only way to shoot the perspective. So we just arbitrarily cut the building in half and left the floor plan intact and showed it in this view. And I think from that standpoint, it's quite effective. The vignette around the edge, or the very sketchiness of it at its edges, I think adds to the artistic quality of it. And the blending of the deep blues into the brown board, I think, is quite a pleasing combination of color. This is a cutaway view of a proposed chapel. The architect on this is also in Indiana. It was Oris Ish. This was done for Mr. Ish, but it was also done not to show the interior of the building, but to express the structure which he is using here. These are thin metal box beams which are welded together all the way along their joint and then tilted up like a giant beam spanning down the entire length of the chapel. And they're only supported at the end here and at the opposite end of the sanctuary. There's no physical connection between this roof beam and the outer wall, and that it's entirely a skylight, completely open to let light come in from above onto the pews. Occasionally we get into a little different type of rendering. I have several ex-Navy officers working for me who are very much interested in naval architecture and doing naval illustrating. And this was a chance we got to use their talent. It's a new methane tanker which is being constructed for the Marathon Oil Company of Marion, Ohio. And here we tried to depict a Mediterranean scene with this tanker forging away towards the U.S. full of methane. The same artist did this rendering when he first came to work for me, and this is the ship which he served on in the Navy after he graduated as an architect. And that's it.
Mr. Howard would very happily answer any questions that you might have. If you would please stand. I wonder if you could see this first. You photograph
in that particular rendering, we had a large aerial photograph which we made a complete overlay of. Of course, when you take an aerial photograph of a downtown area, you get this third or parallax vanishing point where the building seemed to be tilting towards the center of the picture, and that had to be compensated for. We couldn't just take the photograph and paint in the buildings we wanted, so we completely did the rendering but used the photograph in order to find our street locations and foundation locations on the building. That question has been asked many times when people look at the rendering. No, I think for many years it has been uncommon, but it's like any technique. Everyone says it's taboo, and all of a sudden somebody comes along that knows how to use one, and then everybody wished they'd been using one. There's an artist or an architect, a registered architect in New York by the name of Helmut Jacobi, who is probably the world's best known pen and ink illustrator today. He's fairly recent on the rendering scene, and yet he has made just a terrific impact with a lot of the big New York firms, and he combines pen and ink with very light mute tones on an airbrush, and it's an extremely effective technique. Any other questions?
I'd like to ask, what is the average cost of a rendering, and how many man-hours would an average rendering entail? I'm talking total man-hours, secretaries and your whole staff.
On an eye-level view of a small project, the average rendering would run somewhere in the vicinity of $160 to $260. On an aerial view, there's always more work involved on the board. Everything has to be painted. You can't use sky to make the rendering big, and sky is cheap. So the price is always a little higher on an aerial rendering. They generally run for a small aerial rendering of a simple building in the neighborhood of $250. A lot of the school renderings that we do for bond issue purposes run in the vicinity of $350 to $500. A rendering like the one on the top the particular rendering on the top there was done for Albert Kahn Associates in Detroit. if we had laid the perspective out on that rendering and done the complete job, that would probably cost around $1,000 for the meticulous work involved in it. In the particular case, the architect did the complete layout, and we did the painting on that, and I think the cost was somewhere between $600 and $700. The amount of time spent on a rendering, of course, depends on the illustrator. And in my particular firm, we don't do what they call assembly line renderings. There are firms that will have one person doing skies all day, and then it goes to a guy who does glass, and then the next guy does the concrete on the building, and then all they do is this one thing all day, and someone else will just paint trees all day long on the renderings as they come down the line. And there are some very good renderings done this way. It's surprising, and it takes a lot of administrative control, but once it's down, I'm sure it's a very effective way of doing renderings. I don't like to work on an assembly line, and the people that I have attracted into my office are against it, so we have maintained this one-man system where once the perspective is drawn and put on the board, one man is given the entire project and he carries it to completion. I find competitively my prices are higher than the assembly line method. I find many architects prefer the way we do the renderings, in that they get a little more architectural feeling into their building. There are a lot of illustrators doing architectural renderings who are not architecturally trained. In many cases, their renderings range from excellent to acceptable. I think by and large, the best architect, if you're to read a history of architectural rendering, the really great architectural renderers of the past and the ones who, like Jacobi in New York, who are involved in some of the largest projects being built, many of them have master's degree in architecture. And it's only because they were in an architect's office and doing renderings for them that they got the bug and decided they were going to specialize in it. No, many of the renderings, I've seen a lot of renderings in the Indiana Architect by firms in and around this area, which are done in what we historically call a Kautsky type broadside pencil. It's a system of rendering done many years ago by a man who's now dead called Ted Kautsky. I would recommend, I think probably any architect who's been through school has had pencil point. Or I guess they call it Broadside by Ted Kautsky, which is a very good book for students, in that it shows you how to create an architectural feeling in your renderings by just using a soft lead pencil. And we do quite a few broadside pencil renderings. I do some myself on projects, in which it's generally a quicker media, but in many cases it's necessary. It's more important, for instance, for the architect to have 5 interior views of a proposed athletic facility, we'll say, than one good color rendering, and the cost is about equal. No, a good color rendering will reproduce in black and white or in color. The contrast should always be there. If a color rendering doesn't reproduce in black and white, then it's not a very good rendering. Well, in an architectural photography, if you shoot a building from the ground, you shoot a high-rise building, you have to tilt the camera back, and you get a exaggerated perspective, which is unreal looking. In rendering, it becomes very tricky when you do a high-rise building, and that if you do it from the ground, you should really use a three-point perspective and taper it slightly. Now, this causes quite a bit of trouble in laying it out, just due to limitations on size of your boards and so forth. So we generally shoot a high-rise rendering only from eye level. We shoot it from eye level only if the distortion that we get in keeping all lines vertical does not show up too greatly. Now, in this particular photograph, it may even taper out slightly, and that the camera projector is tilted in relation to the screen here. You would probably have a feeling that it does tilt out. But even the actual rendering, if you were to look at it and set it on the floor and look down at it, it would look like it tapered out to you. And the only way to view a rendering like that is to set the horizon in the perspective at the same eye line that the person looking at the picture is standing. And then he will get a very accurate conception of a correct perspective. So it is a little tricky on high-rise buildings. I generally say the building was twice as tall as the one that I showed there. I would prefer to move up, say, to the 14th floor for my horizon, so that I'd be 14 stories high when looking at it, and you immediately overcome this illusion that you're talking about. And occasionally it offends somebody that they look at it just at a little bit of an angle and they see this flare out. In photography, of course, the only way to overcome it is with a camera that the front face and the back face tilts, so that you can overcome the parallax that you create. In transparent watercolor, when you make a mistake, you start over. In casein, or the renderings we showed here, most of them were done with a product called Shiva casein, which is a milk-based tempera paint. And if a mistake is made, you merely change color and paint right over it. And it's completely opaque. And there is a certain quality in watercolor illustrations. I think the best watercolor illustrations I have seen are not really very finely detailed architecturally. They tend to be looser, and the quality of the rendering is not really less. It may be just as good. The renderings that most architects buy, though, they find that their clients want to sit down and they want to pick that building over. Maybe they're looking for mistakes, but nevertheless, they want to be able to see every windowsill and every mullion and so forth. And this is on some of the reflecting surfaces, we take the casein and water it down rather than try to blend in opaque paints. Many of the renderings you saw here, well, for instance, the high-rise that the young man over here was talking about, the first thing we did there was paint every window jet black, right out of the tube. And then over that, we laid in washes of a watered-down white casein with a lot of ochre, and towards the bottom we get into a lot of blues, and on the top we add a lot of browns and burnt siennas and so forth. Laid them in on washes. Well, of course, the easiest thing to say is that, as the architects would say, is that his client should have given him the budget to landscape the building. In many cases, there is no allotment at the time the building is designed, to do what it would be considered an adequate job of landscaping. You find the particular things you're talking about, I don't think you find, for instance, on where new campus sites are developed, where you have an urban or a suburban site to work with. Generally, you have trees, and by adding more of them, it doesn't offend anybody. When you get into urban renewal projects where they're demolishing old buildings downtown, which was the case with several of the renderings you probably saw in Indianapolis. I know when I didn't do the rendering on the new federal building in Indianapolis. I was barely getting started in business when that building was designed. I saw the rendering the first time I went to Indianapolis. And I thought it was an excellent rendering. It was done by a New York firm. It had everything you're talking about in it, as far as lushness of surroundings to enhance the building, and yet, as I saw the building in its near completion, it was nowhere near the striking, or it didn't have near the striking entourage that the rendering did. I think it's honest for the illustrator to do it, and that it is his job to make the architect's building look its best. It, of course, is the community's job, after this building is built, to complete their renewal project so that the buildings do look good in their surroundings. As far as books are concerned? Right, I have one book here. I've looked through a lot of bookstores and seen quite a few books on renderings. Occasionally I get ads from the different publishing houses saying this is a trial offer, send for this book on renderings, and if you're not satisfied with it, return it in 15 days, and I generally send them back in 15 days. Because I myself have found no replacement for a book which was probably 15 years old. It's published by, or the author of it is Albert Halsey, H-A-L-S-E. I know your library on campus probably has a copy of this, doesn't it? It has a complete history. It's published by F.W. Dodge. I don't see the first printing in here. This particular one was 1960. But it has a complete history of architectural renderings. There's drawings in here by some of the oldest first architects, city planners within the ancient dynasties, and how they illustrated their ideas. It goes on through American architecture, and then immediately into rules for composition. It gives you how to lay out perspectives, simple forms of presentation in black and white, how to reflect light off the ground, and how to develop this sun, shade, and shadow. Probably the best thing for the student is it has chapters showing other students' work. Most of it is from Columbia University. It has a great deal of information on how to handle different materials, how to make brick walls look like brick walls, how to make shingles look like shingles, developing skies. It touches on every media of rendering, from airbrush to pen and ink, black and white, casein. It has a complete section on colors and developing a palette in your rendering. It has many plates on prints of full color renderings where he goes into discussing what makes this a good rendering. And then he'll go to the next subject and talk about that rendering and what palette was used, how he created shades and shadows and so forth. And in the back of the book, this book I purchased when I first became interested in rendering, and I have always used it. And when I first started doing rendering, this book was always open when I was doing a rendering. Probably some of Mr. Graham's renderings here. I use this as a guide because there's no end of information or situations that they picture here. They have what they call a library of architectural renderings, or a gallery of professional renderings in the background, in which they show renderings by probably 10 famous illustrators from Kempa and Schwartz in New York, who do a lot of the color renderings you see of skyscrapers in New York. They do not have Jacobi's renderings in it. He was not doing renderings at that time, which are worth looking into as a student. If you write to the Armstrong Tile or Cork Company, who produces a great many ceiling systems, in which they advertise in architectural magazines by using renderings by Helmut Jacobi, they will send you a brochure that they have containing a short biography of Mr. Jacobi and also plates of probably 15 or 20 of his more popular renderings. I would say anybody interested in being an architect should have this book on his list of reference. I don't consider it a textbook or something you just read once. To me, it's a continuous reference book. Architectural renderings. By Albert O. Halsey, and the subtitle is Techniques of Contemporary Presentation. They have several articles in here and also on how to dress up even the plan view of a building, or how to show landscaping on your plot plan. Maybe you want to develop a plan of the building and then turn it into a plot plan on the outside of it to show where your plantings would be in the gardens. And they show how this is done in color, recommended palettes to use, and so forth. There's one thing we always remember: when you're masking, you use drafting tape. When you're drafting, you use masking tape. Now, I don't know why they make it that way, but drafting tape is no good. It won't hold a piece of paper down to a drafting board. So I use masking tape. But if I'm masking something off, I use drafting tape because I don't want it to pull my paint up.
I think that's a pretty good place to end the questions. We appreciate your comment.